present again.
They didn't have any news.
And they had no
news. They had little programs, funny things,
the normal,
movies, but nothing about what was really going on nationwide.
Yeah.
So people were not informed. They did not want, they were censored.
Yeah. And throughout Evo Morales' rule, especially the second and third term, whoever, whatever news agent or whatever news persona said something against him or something that revealed something he had done or his party had done, they would disappear, or they would, you know, get completely taken out of their news agency or removed or exiled. Many news people, very important people, were exiled, and maybe they'll come back now. But that's why most of the videos are from, you know, Instagram or any like social media. And this is another march. People were, you know, marching day and night. People didn't sleep, I think, for 21 days. So people were marching, mobilizing everywhere. No cars were moving. That's another thing that I wanted to mention about the paralyzation. No cars were allowed to move. And there was a video that I wanted to put, and I couldn't find it, but there was a video of, during this time, of course, the only cars allowed to move or transit were emergency cars. So ambulances, for example. There was many instances where they saw that ambulances started moving and transiting far more than usual. And all of a sudden, they stopped one. They decided to stop them to see why they were transiting so much. And they asked the ambulance people, please open up, what are you carrying? Oh, we're carrying sick people, blah, blah. They stopped them, they said, fine, open. They were carrying arms, high caliber arms. And so people really realized, you know, this is going to be very scary and this is huge, but people did not stop. So the nationwide mobilization
we controlled all the cars.
Yes.
Everything was controlled.
And that's right.
Ambulances, police cars, we controlled everything.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to prevent that, because that was discovered, and then we realized that they were arming some sectors that maybe then were going to attack us as people. Because I was sitting on the street for 8 hours a day, in 2 periods, 4 hours, from 11 to 3, and then from 6 to 11 or midnight, every single day, taking care of the corner of my street. And there was a group of people, so all the neighbors would go, and there were like every 3 or 4 blocks, we would have a roundup, and then we would block the street. We had a string that is called pitita, and now it's very famous, and in pitita, it's even in Twitter and everywhere, because Evo Morales made fun of our pititas. He said, you think you're going to show that? When he said, you think you're going to block with your pititas, with your little strings, he was like making fun of us, saying, you think you're going to get somewhere? Why don't I teach you how to block a country? Why don't I teach you how to really do harsh protests? Because he was specialized in that, of course.
Yeah, and that's why he was arming people and doing all this violent kind of.
We were afraid that that they were going to arm, and they actually did arm the, you know, many irregular groups that then attacked the peaceful protesters.
Yeah. So moving on. Oh, there was one more video. Yes, and this was Oruro, and people are screaming to respect the votes, basically. And these are the police that are guarding the tribunal. So everything was done with a chant. And this is when they're saying, my vote is respected. And this is how it happened throughout the entire nation. So that was just to show. And so, moving on to the next slide, we'll see that it wasn't only Bolivia that was mobilizing, it was the entire world. The Bolivians around the world. I was part of many protests in Miami. As you see here, like these are the Latin kind of countries as well as the US, so the Americas. This was Bolivia. Over there, Europe. With time, like we even got more protests. There was even Japan, there was Hong Kong, there was Mozambique. Truly, it was, you know, protests absolutely everywhere. But that Bolivians found themselves. They truly organized themselves to at least contribute, even if it's from far, with the morale and to give that support to the Bolivian people back home. So, the dictator's response. I wanted to kind of put this out there because, as my mom mentioned, the peaceful protests were led by flags and strings to just block the streets. Yet Evo Morales, he ordered the police to disperse protesters with tear gas, with, you know, those tear gas bombs. He armed irregular groups, And he armed these groups to attack the protesters, which caused a lot of casualties, actually. And then it was found that the irregular groups were not even just Bolivian groups. The FARC was involved. So there were militants from the FARC, the Colombian guerrilla. There were Venezuelan militants, there were Cuban militants, Argentinians, Brazilians, and many more were found. So it was really not really only Bolivia's affair. It became an affair of all these kind of guerrilla members and militants and socialists.
21st century.
Yeah, Foro de Sao Paulo, truly. Supporters, and they wanted Evo to remain and to maintain and make a dictatorship and to become Venezuela, basically. And that's why they were truly attacking and doing all they could to make the plan move forward. And on top of that, to get some support of other people other than his militia groups, Evo Morales and his party started paying poor people. So at the beginning, the poor people, it seems, they agreed to the payment. You know, it was like 20 bolivianos, 50, 100, 200. That's like equivalent to up to $20. And they were paid and armed with dynamite, Molotov bombs, machetes, sticks, like stones, whatever, truly, to go and attack the protesters. And it was extremely sad also because there were many videos that I didn't want to put because they were too graphic. But many videos showed, you know, indigenous poor people that didn't know how to use these bombs, for example. And so they bombed themselves by mistake. They would not throw the dynamite or the Molotovs fast enough. And they lost hands, they lost limbs. One of them, you know, lost half his face. It was awful. And they interviewed many of them in the hospitals, asking them, why were you there? Why were you doing that? Why were you trying to attack peaceful protesters? And they said, no, they made me. Many of them were not even paid anymore. They were forced and they were threatened to, like the leaders of their communities would threaten them, we will take away your land, we will burn your home. And these people, you know, they have so little and so much to lose at the same time. So it was extremely sad, and at the end of the day, at the end of everything, many resulted dead and hundreds injured. I think it adds up to almost 200 injured. So there was systematic state violence across the entire country, and this was in Santa Cruz. So this was before the police changed sides. They were still, you know, listening to the orders of the government. And many people were injured by these tear gas bombs because a few people, like two people, well, one guy younger than me, like 20 years old, and one girl that was a university student my age, they passed away because like the tear gas bombs like exploded on them directly. So it was really terrible as these things happened. And then on top of that, Evo Morales has very high control of the Cocalero group in Bolivia, and so it's the group that grows the coca leaf. And in Bolivia, it is kind of historically accepted to chew coca leaves, but it's, you know, you chew like a few leaves. The indigenous people do that. They chew a few leaves. They're used to that. It's like a millenary type of custom that they have, or they make coca tea, or they include coca in their, you know, in their foods. So, unfortunately, though, Evo Morales, among many of the legislations he changed, he also exponentially increased the possibility of the land used for coca production and coca growth. So previous to him, the maximum amount of land was about 9,000 hectares. 9,000 hectares. And that was enough to supply all of the domestic need and all of the domestic market. When Evo went in, he abolished those laws, he got rid of the DEA, and he increased it to what it is today, like 23,000 hectares of the coca growth. And so he controls these coca groups, and he's actually the president of all the federations of coca growers. So it's also his self-interest, and that's why he changed legislations to his own interest. And I didn't want to talk about this too much because, you know, it's a little controversial. But yes, so he sent his coca to attack the cities. And they were heavily armed. Even until today, they're still attacking sometimes with these are peaceful protesters, and all they did was, like, you know, throw back the gas and like try to run away from the Molotov.
saying how the cocaderos are destroying
Esto va a ser un enfrentamiento muy duro, muy duro. Se están respondiendo, se están agrupando más. Se están agrupando más.
Yeah, the cocaderos are the and just like burn things, destroy things,
Y no te llevan la policía, es lo más triste. La policía no va a venir aquí a ver. Ya he cortado la...
Yeah,
they may not know.
Okay, so the thing is though, let's just think about that for a second. 9,000 hectares was enough to supply the domestic demand, and more than enough. Of coca leaves. And so we have this excess of about, 14,000 hectares. And we start wondering what it's used for. And so it's used for the cocaine industry that also Evo Morales was leading. And so the cocaine industry in Bolivia exponentially grew. Bolivia currently supplies 30% of the world's cocaine. And so that's the high interest Evo Morales has, actually. And that's why he wanted to go back. That's why he was trying to, do whatever to go back to Bolivia once he resigned, and that was his plan. And of course, that's also the interest of Venezuela, of other countries that are involved in this industry and in this trade. Because on top of everything, in the jungle of Chapare, where the increase of the coca growth was mainly made, so like where the hectares really exponentially grew, in that jungle, with state money, Evo Morales built the best international airport of Bolivia, in the middle of the jungle. And this airport has no flights, and there's no population. The closest village is called Chimore, and it has about like 3,000 people dispersed because they live in the jungle. And so these people don't take flights, regardless. And so this airport, it's an international airport. It has better and more, advanced facilities and technology than the biggest airports in Bolivia, or the supposedly like the most important ones, which are in La Paz, Santa Cruz. Those are the main international airports, and Cochabamba as well. But so this airport, he invested about almost like 200 million to make this airport, and it was guarded by military all the time. So people could not even go there. It was a national airport, but people could not enter it anyway. Some people went to like find out, and they said, they have videos where they said, the military is always guarding it. No one really knows what flights go in or out, but they started noticing that flights from Mexico were going in and out, private, like unregistered kind of planes, Venezuela planes, armed forces planes from Cuba and Venezuela and Bolivia were taking, drugs across the borders that way. And even they noticed Spanish planes, so they were taking drugs directly to Spain or to Europe. So it was truly controversial what he did, and that was with state money on top of that. So that's another huge
motivator for him to stay.
Exactly, that's a whole new area.
To be against him.
Exactly, and that's a whole new area where really, if we investigated it, I could talk about it for hours because there's so much there. And it's like a huge controversial issue, which we're still uncovering today. Because on top of that, he was highly associated with these narcotráfico groups, like drug trafficking groups. So for example, another example, which I didn't put in the presentation, but I think it's good to mention it now that we're talking about this. El Chapo's son, so El Chapo, like the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, biggest one in the world, his sons were in Bolivia for many months, and they had, this new government started finding, the paperwork the old government had, and within the paperwork there were permits for the two sons to be in Bolivia with like diplomatic passes type of things and direct access to the Congress, and they were living like in the presidential palace with Evo Morales, and so, yes. So it was extremely controversial, and that's another area that we can also look into. And so, moving on, here is just a little video I made along with like a news agency in Bolivia.
Bolivia is in a state of emergency. After the biggest fraud in Bolivia, orchestrated by Evo Morales as he tries to remain in power for the fourth unconstitutional term, the government sent paramilitaries, armed poor civilians, and armed militia to promote violence, attack the peaceful protesters, and even kill 2 of them in recent confrontations.
That was the 11th.
Evo Morales even declared he would enclose the cities, not allowing food or vital needs to be available for the population. After the government's threats, the militia, the police's numerous gasifications, and the continual violent confrontations, people have not reduced their morale as they take the streets on the 11th day of peaceful resistance, while they continue pleading for the respect of their votes, a transparent election, the respect of the Constitution of Bolivia. The world must know the state of Bolivia before it's too late.
So that was the 11th day, and I want to show that as the progression of the protests. And as the days went by, Morales really heightened the violence. So at this point, he threatened, as in the video it mentioned, like he threatened to siege the cities to prevent people and the cities from getting any vital needs, from getting food. And so, you know, it was extremely controversial what he was saying, because that was, you know, getting into what genocide is of his own population.
How undemocratic.
And completely undemocratic, exactly. And so he threatened even water supply at one point. He got so, you know, flustered that the people didn't give up after his threats, and he threatened to cut water supply from the biggest cities, which were La Paz and Santa Cruz. So to kill the most amount of people. And so his aggressive and inhumane actions truly, instead of doing what he thought, you know, which was to diminish and discourage the protesters, this actually increased the popular determination to continue fighting, no matter what, because this man had to leave and had to, you know, leave forever, truly. Because at the beginning, the demand of the peaceful protesters was a second round. As time progressed, they demanded to annul the elections and run new elections. And then once he said these things, they said, you know what, forget it, he needs to leave. And so the demands ended up in the fact that he had to renounce and, you know, forever just, you know, never run again and just leave from his power, basically. So as this happened, more people joined the protests. Eventually, the police started refusing to do what the government was saying because they started noticing how they were also causing all this disruption, causing deaths, and they started realizing that what their leader was saying was completely inhumane and unconstitutional, undemocratic, etc. And so the police did mutiny, and the military, many sectors of the military, the armed forces, started also saying that they will not oppress the people. They started telling, because that's what the Bolivians were extremely scared about. What if the military turns against us and, you know, follows the orders of Evo Morales, as they did in Nicaragua, as they did in Venezuela? So that was the main true concern of the Bolivian people. And so many military divisions started saying they will not do that, they will be with the people no matter what. Evo Morales offered like $3,000 bonuses to the police, for example, and the police still performed the mutiny. And over here, I just wanted to show a video which shows Evo before and all that he said, because just to explain in English before the video starts in Spanish, before he always used to say, oh, Evo is always with the people. Evo does what the people said, what the people say. Evo's constitutional. Like, he always talks about himself in the third person on top of that, so it's kind of funny. But, and Evo, the Evo on top of that.
Well, so his Twitter handle is what?
Yeah, Evo is Pueblo. Yeah. Yeah, like Evo is the people. Yeah, Evo is the people. So he always used to say, you know, oh, being, you know, dictating what I will do or dictating something against the people, that is something of colonialism. So I'm a different kind of person. I'm anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. So we can watch the video now. And it shows a bit of Bolivia too, so I wanted to show that.
Yo amo, ejecuto lo que me manda el pueblo.
I do what the people say. So this video was made to kind of, after he did all those declarations of, you know, seizing the cities, not letting supply, etc.
Tú estás imaginando que Evo impone todo. Te equivocas.
You're wrong if you think I impose this.
No me mientes, que tiene una norma constitucionalizada a la suma de gente.
There's a constitutional norm.
Y ser rojo.
Yo quiero decir además.
It's like a historical video they made at
Right, they did this.
This was the president of the biggest university in Bolivia he was saying, we were in the protest, and he said the day previous to that, being attacked, he said that people will not give up until we get our democracy. Democracy will not, be taken away from us. And so they attacked him. That's the Amazon fires, actually. So this is kind of showing what Evo has done to the country throughout these years.
They say that he does something against the people.
They started burning private homes. It was really terrible. So those are the protests, how people were getting gassed. Finally, these were the police that started joining the people, so they were getting applauded. And these were the protests daily. So people just, no one went to work, no one went to school, no one did anything except protest. And 21F, those were the protests for the referendum. And now we're protesting, no matter what, because we knew it was at risk. Okay, so then the next slide. So here was the official police mutiny. The entire police of the entire nation performed this mutiny, and so they went out of their police headquarters, etc. Exactly, stationed at headquarters around the entire country. And they started saying, we are with the people. And they came up with the flags, no to the fraud, etc. And people just went, the entirety of Bolivia, which was just incredibly happy, because this was truly what showed, a huge advance in our retaking of our democracy. And then, as that would happen, the armed forces, more of the divisions started, going with the police's movement, and they said they would refuse and they would not oppress the people of the nation. And so then that brings us to November 10th. All of those days between the election and November 10th, people were protesting and people were waiting for the report of the OAS. So the OAS was making this investigation of the fraud. And Evo Morales kept saying there was no fraud, that they should check vote by vote. And that's another thing. For example, personal experience, they did not let me vote here in Miami in the consulate due to some technical difficulty. And it turns out, well, for transparency reasons, you are allowed to go online to the official site of the electoral count, and you put your passport number or your identity number, and your vote comes out and the location where you voted. My vote was actually made in Santa Cruz, and I'm in Miami. And this was not only my case. It was like 7 out of 10 friends of mine, for example, that's the percentage, 70%. They voted also in Bolivia when they're abroad. They're studying in Canada, Europe, US, etc. Another thing, grandparents or dead, the deceased, they voted. Anyone that was missing voted. So it was really ridiculous, and it was just so obvious what was really going on. And even with that, they couldn't figure it out, and that's why they stopped they stopped the count for 24 hours to figure out what else they could do. So on November 10th, the OAS really confirmed the fraud. They concluded that there were too many irregularities throughout the entire electoral process and throughout all the components of the electoral process. And as a result of that, well, the OAS actually recommended that the election had to be annulled, and that new elections with a new electoral tribunal had to be conducted. So as a result of those recommendations and that kind of certification of the fraud, the armed forces, the highest head of the armed forces, who was actually very friendly and close to Evo Morales, he sent a letter to Evo Morales suggesting that he steps down because clearly the violations were too big, far too proven, And the constitutional violations had to be observed, and the military's objective is to defend the Constitution. So he sent that letter to Evo Morales. And at that point, since the military was not with him, since the police was not with him, and since all of Bolivia was still protesting, Evo Morales resigned and escaped to Mexico. So in light of the official report of the fraud, the intensification of the popular unrest, and the police and military support that was taken away from the government, Evo Morales resigned, and he ended up fleeing to Mexico on November 10th. Mexico sent a plane of the armed forces to pick him up. No one gave aerospace to the plane except for Paraguay, which is the other landlocked country of South America. So they had a few difficulties getting out, but at the end he ended up in the Ciudad de Mexico. And yes, that's where he was granted political asylum. And it's quite controversial what he did since then, because also he has been insinuating and inciting violence. So the next slide. And along with that, as soon as he resigned, many of his party kind of government officials and people started resigning and fleeing as well, because they knew that they were going to be subject to a lot of repercussions for what they had done, for what they had been involved with. So this is just a little video of the So he resigned. People went to celebrate. It was really glorious.
Lo pudimos lograr. Yo primero quiero agradecerle a Dios porque hizo posible todo este tiempo. Quiero agradecerle al pueblo boliviano porque estuvimos unidos. Pero quiero agradecerle también
The protest turned from being a sad one to a very happy one. And so they brought music and people were dancing. But we also have to consider, of course, that maybe resigned. Congress has to resign. So we still had a few steps. Yet the people really saw this as the biggest step. Yes, after 21 days. And actually, the peaceful protests marked the largest peaceful protest in the world in modern history, because it was truly all of Bolivia that was paralyzed. It was more than 2 million people protesting.
No, only in Santa Cruz 2 million people. Everywhere else it was like at least, I don't know, 600,000 in La Paz,
yeah, so it was truly immense.
So there were at least 6 million people protesting at the same time in Bolivia.
So
and Bolivia has only 11 million population.
Yes. So this brings us to kind of the conclusion, but I wanted to observe a few of the issues that have happened since his escape to Mexico and his granting of the political asylum. So from Mexico, Morales has been citing violence, and many people didn't really understand why, since he already fled, he was already far away. But the reason was what we mentioned earlier, which is the drug trafficking and the extreme amount of wealth in that sector. And he's still, until today, he's still the president of all the federations of cocaleros in Bolivia, which are from Cochabamba, from the Chapare, which are 6 federations. And these have leaders, and below them are all the cocaleros, so the people that are growing the coca. And so something else that one has to understand is that not all cocaleros are bad. Many of them, they're just abused really and used to grow the coca. A study shows that the ones that are growing the plant make about $2,000 per year, while the heads are of course making millions per week. So it's really a disparity there, and those people, those cocaleros, I found this out actually because I've been quite active in helping Bolivia from abroad. And so on Instagram, for example, I was very active, and I got contacted by many people in Bolivia as well as out of Bolivia, and I got contacted by this girl who's the daughter of a cocalero, actually. And she wanted to tell me her side of the story and what was going on with her family. And she explained how her father was in the Chapare, in the jungle. He's just a grower, so he's an indigenous man. And her family is in the city. So the city was getting attacked by her father's group of people, which were the cocaleros. And the father didn't want to, but they were threatening the cocaleros to take away the only the only form of subsistence that they have, which is growing coca. So they were threatening to take away their right to grow coca.